After 30 years of paying taxes, mowing my lawn every weekend, and following every rule put in front of me, I never imagined I'd wake up to hate mail telling me I didn't belong in my own home. That morning started like any other. Coffee brewing, the house quiet, the kind of calm you earn after decades of hard work. But the moment I opened my front door, that calm shattered. Taped directly to my porch railing was a thick envelope. No return address. My name written in block letters that felt angry even before I opened it. Inside were multiple pages. Not just one letter, but several. Each one more aggressive than the last. They accused me of stealing land, of violating community rules, of damaging the character of the neighborhood. The words weren't sloppy or emotional. They were structured, deliberate, almost legal in tone. Phrases like unauthorized encroachment and corrective action will be taken jumped off the page. This wasn't some unhinged neighbor ranting. This was organized, intentional, and whoever wrote it wanted me scared. As I stood there reading, my stomach tightened. I felt anger first, then disbelief, then something colder, fear. I walked to my mailbox hoping that was the end of it. It wasn't. Inside were more envelopes. Same handwriting, same tone, same message. Over and over again, telling me I was in the wrong, telling me I'd be dealt with, telling me my land wasn't really mine. I remember thinking, how does this even happen? I've lived here quietly. I've never caused problems. I've never taken what didn't belong to me. What bothered me most wasn't just the hate. It was how official it all felt. These letters read like they were written by someone who knew the system, someone who understood how to intimidate without crossing an obvious legal line. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't random harassment. This was pressure. Calculated pressure. My mind went straight to the HOA. Over the last several months, their presence in my life had grown in ways that felt unnecessary and personal. More notices, more inspections, more questions about my property that had never come up before. And right at the center of all of it was one person, Linda Whitmore, the HOA president. A homeowner just like me, at least on paper, but someone who carried herself like she owned the entire neighborhood. Standing there on my porch, clutching those letters, I finally understood something I'd been avoiding. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about community standards. This was about control. Someone wanted something I had, and they were willing to push me out to get it. I went back inside and sat at my kitchen table, spreading the letters out in front of me like evidence at a crime scene. The accusations, the timing, the language. It all lined up too perfectly. And that's when another realization hit me, heavier than the first. This didn't start today. This didn't even start with the letters. It started months ago with a single conversation I tried to forget. I leaned back in my chair and remembered the exact moment everything changed. The day Linda Whitmore stood on my property, looked me in the eye, and questioned whether my land was really mine at all. When Linda Whitmore stood on my lawn and told me part of it wasn't mine, she said it with the confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome. I remember the day clearly because at the time, I brushed it off as just another awkward HOA interaction. Looking back now, I realize that moment was the real beginning of everything I'm dealing with today. It was a quiet afternoon when I saw her walking up my driveway. She didn't call ahead, didn't wave. She just came straight toward my backyard fence, clipboard in hand, heels sinking slightly into the grass like she was inspecting a property she planned to buy. Linda introduced herself as the HOA president, even though I already knew exactly who she was. Around the neighborhood, her name carried weight. Not because people liked her, but because people didn't want problems. Her voice was calm, almost friendly, but there was something sharp underneath it. She gestured toward my fence and casually said she believed it crossed into HOA common land. Not asked, not questioned, stated, like a conclusion she'd reached long before stepping foot on my property. I told her that couldn't be right. I'd had a county survey done when I bought the house. Everything was documented. Everything was legal. I went inside, grabbed the survey and laid it out right there on the hood of my truck. I pointed to the lines, the measurements, the official stamps. I expected at least a pause, maybe a conversation. Instead, Linda barely glanced at it. She waved her hand dismissively and said surveys can be wrong, especially older ones. That was the first moment I felt something shift. This wasn't a discussion. This was her telling me my proof didn't matter. She straightened up and reminded me she was the HOA president, responsible for protecting community assets. The way she said it made it clear she saw herself as the final authority. I suddenly understood how uneven the situation was. I was one homeowner. She represented the board, the rules, the fines, the legal threats, and she knew it. Then came the part that stuck with me the most. She leaned in slightly and lowered her voice, like she was offering friendly advice. She said it would be easier for everyone if I didn't push back. That the board doesn't like homeowners who make things difficult. She smiled when she said it, but the message was clear. Compliance would be rewarded. Resistance would not. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking it. I dealt with HOAs before. This was probably just standard posturing. Linda left soon after, heels clicking back down the driveway, leaving me standing there with my survey still in my hands and an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite explain. What I didn't know then was that from that day forward, my house became a target. Inspections that had never happened before suddenly became routine. Notices started appearing in my mailbox over things no one had ever cared about. Questions about my property boundaries kept coming up, always framed as concerns from the board. Standing there months later with hate mail spread across my kitchen table, that memory came rushing back with terrifying clarity. Linda hadn't been investigating. She'd been asserting ownership. And that calm, confident way she spoke to me on my own lawn wasn't confidence at all. It was a warning. Because as she turned to leave that day, she stopped, looked back at me and said something I didn't fully understand until now. She said the board doesn't appreciate pushback. And once they decide something, they rarely change their minds. They didn't come at me with bulldozers or police cars. They came with envelopes, fines, and enough paperwork to wear anyone down. After that conversation with Linda on my lawn, something changed almost immediately. At first, it was subtle enough that I questioned myself. One notice showed up in my mailbox about my trash cans being visible for too long. Another claimed my grass was a fraction of an inch over regulation height. Things no one had ever mentioned in the years I'd lived there. Within weeks, those notices multiplied. Every few days, there was another envelope waiting for me, stamped with the HOA's logo like an official warning label. The accusations were petty, technical, and relentless. My fence was under review. My shed needed verification. My property was flagged for potential non-compliance. Each letter referenced bylaws in dense legal language that seemed intentionally confusing. It felt less like enforcement and more like an attempt to overwhelm me. Then came the fines. Small at first, almost insulting. $50 here, $75 there. But every letter carried a warning that continued violations would result in escalating penalties. I did the math one night and realized that if this kept up, they could bleed me financially without ever stepping foot on my property again. That realization hit harder than any threat. This wasn't about correcting behavior. This was about pressure. What made it worse was that the hate mail never stopped. Some days I'd pull HOA notices out of the mailbox only to find anonymous letters mixed in. Same accusations, same language, same fixation on my land. It was impossible not to notice how closely the timing lined up. When an HOA notice arrived, hate mail followed. When fines increased, the letters became more aggressive. Whoever was behind this knew exactly how to keep the stress constant. Slowly, the neighborhood around me started to feel different. People I'd waved to for years suddenly avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when I walked by. I could feel eyes on my back when I worked in my yard. Whether the rumors were true or not didn't matter. The damage was being done. Isolation set in, and with it came a quiet kind of fear. The kind that makes you feel like you're standing alone against something much bigger than yourself. At night, I'd sit at my kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, trying to make sense of it all. That's when the pattern finally became impossible to ignore. Every violation tied back to the same issue: property boundaries, land use, common area concerns. It was all circling the same accusation Linda had made months earlier, just dressed up in official language and legal threats. The pressure wasn't accidental. It was coordinated. Someone wanted me exhausted, confused, and scared enough to give in. And the more I resisted, the tighter the grip became. I started to understand why so many people just comply with HOAs, even when they're right. Fighting back takes energy, time, money, and they count on you running out of all three. Then one afternoon, another letter arrived, different from the rest. This one wasn't a violation or a fine. It was a notice for a special HOA meeting. The subject line read, "Boundary Enforcement and Community Assets." My name wasn't mentioned, but I knew exactly who it was about. The timing was too perfect. I stood there holding the letter, feeling that familiar knot in my stomach tighten again. Part of me hoped this meeting would clear things up, that maybe this had all been some misunderstanding that could finally be resolved face to face. What I didn't know then was that walking into that meeting would do the opposite, because I was about to learn that Linda Whitmore's interest in my property had nothing to do with rules, and everything to do with something she wanted for herself. I walked into that HOA meeting thinking I was defending myself. I walked out realizing I was standing in the way of something much bigger. The room was already full when I arrived. Chairs pulled close together, voices low, the kind of tension you can feel before anyone even speaks. This wasn't a routine HOA gathering about landscaping or parking. People knew something was coming, even if they didn't know exactly what. Linda Whitmore sat at the front of the room, posture straight, papers neatly stacked, looking completely at ease. When the meeting was called to order, she didn't waste time. She went straight for me. In front of everyone, she accused me of encroaching on HOA-owned land, saying my backyard fence crossed into common property and had done so for some time. The way she said it made it sound like an established fact, not an allegation. She held up a set of maps as proof. From where I was sitting, I could already tell something was off. The maps were old, noticeably old, with faded lines and outdated markings. As she explained them, I realized they didn't match any current county records I'd seen. The property lines were inconsistent, shifted just enough to support her claim. I felt my jaw tighten. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. When I pointed out the discrepancies and mentioned my county survey, Linda's tone changed. The calm confidence disappeared, replaced by irritation. She cut me off mid-sentence and insisted the HOA's documentation carried more weight. I noticed several board members exchanging uneasy looks. No one spoke up, but their body language said everything. They knew this wasn't as clear-cut as Linda was pretending. As the discussion continued, Linda grew more aggressive. Her voice sharpened. She leaned forward, emphasizing every word about protecting HOA assets and correcting past oversights. The more questions I asked, the more defensive she became. It was like watching someone struggle to keep a lid on something that didn't want to stay hidden. Then she said something that made the room go quiet. Almost casually, she mentioned that reclaiming the land would allow the HOA to make better use of the space in the future. She didn't explain what that meant, and no one asked, but the implication hung in the air. This wasn't about enforcing rules. This was about plans. About potential. That single comment stuck with me long after the meeting moved on. I'd lived next to that strip of land for years, and no one had ever cared about it before. It wasn't maintained. It wasn't used. It certainly wasn't valuable enough to justify this level of aggression. So why now? Why suddenly frame it as an asset worth fighting over? As the meeting wrapped up, Linda tried to regain her composed tone, summarizing the issue as if it had been resolved. But the damage was done. I could see doubt spreading across the room, even if no one openly challenged her. I left with more questions than answers, my head spinning with everything that didn't add up. That night, I pulled out every map and document I had. I compared my survey to the ones Linda had shown, tracing the lines over and over until something clicked. The disputed strip of land wasn't just random. It sat directly along the edge of my property. And when I followed it further, my stomach dropped. Because that land didn't just border mine. It connected straight to Linda Whitmore's own property. That strip of land had sat untouched for decades. So why did Linda suddenly want it the moment I moved in? That question kept looping in my head the night after the HOA meeting, refusing to let me sleep. I've owned enough property over the years to know one thing for certain. Land nobody cares about doesn't suddenly become important unless there's a reason. And whatever that reason was, Linda hadn't said it out loud. Long after midnight, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, surrounded by papers, surveys, and old HOA notices. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the clicking of my mouse as I pulled up county records. I wasn't looking to start a war. I was looking for answers. And the deeper I dug, the more uneasy I felt. I started with plat maps, comparing current records to older filings. Then I moved on to zoning documents, scrolling through dense pages of technical language most people never bother to read. That's when I noticed it. A thin strip of land, barely noticeable unless you were specifically looking for it, ran directly along the back of my property. On its own, it didn't look like much. But when I traced it further, my chest tightened. That strip didn't end at my fence. It continued straight into Linda Whitmore's property. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Suddenly, her confidence made sense. Her refusal to look at my survey. Her insistence that the HOA's documents mattered more than county records. If that land could be reclassified or reclaimed by the HOA, it wouldn't stay HOA land for long. It would become leverage, a stepping stone, a way for Linda to expand what she already owned. I dug further, narrowing my search to Linda's name. That's when I found it. Past zoning requests she'd submitted years earlier. Applications that had been denied. Requests to alter land use, to adjust boundaries, to make changes that would have directly benefited her property. Each one had been rejected by the county. At the time, I'm sure she'd been frustrated. But frustration doesn't disappear. It waits. As I connected the dots, my doubt turned into something heavier. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't sloppy HOA management. This was self-interest, plain and simple. Linda wasn't enforcing rules. She was finishing something she'd started years ago, using the HOA as her tool. What bothered me most was how long it had taken me to see it. I'd assumed good faith. I'd assumed the system worked the way it was supposed to, but the pattern was undeniable now. The sudden inspections, the fines, the hate mail, the public accusations, all of it served one purpose: to pressure me into giving up ground, literally. Still, I needed confirmation. Records can tell you what happened, but people tell you why. And if Linda had tried this before, someone had to remember. Someone who'd been here long enough to see how the HOA used to operate before she took control. The next morning, I approached a neighbor who'd lived on the street longer than almost anyone else. I asked if we could talk sometime, casually at first. He hesitated, glanced around, and then nodded slowly. He didn't want to talk in public, didn't want to be seen. Finally, he told me to come by his place later that evening, quietly, because as he put it, this wasn't the first time Linda Whitmore had gone after land that wasn't hers. When a neighbor told me Linda had tried this before, my stomach dropped, because it meant this was planned. I arrived at his house just after sunset, the kind of quiet hour when most people are settling in for the night. He opened the door only halfway at first, glanced behind me, then stepped aside and waved me in without a word. That alone told me this conversation wasn't going to be casual. His name was Frank, a retired homeowner who'd lived in the neighborhood since long before I bought my place. As soon as we sat down, he lowered his voice, even though we were alone. He told me he didn't like getting involved in HOA drama, but what was happening to me felt familiar. Too familiar. That's when he said the words that changed everything. Linda Whitmore had tried to take land before. Years ago, long before I ever moved in, Linda had raised similar boundary concerns, about another homeowner's property. Same approach, same language. Claims that certain areas were HOA-controlled common land. According to Frank, the previous HOA board looked into it and shut it down. The surveys didn't support her claims, and the county records were clear. She lost, and she didn't take it well. Frank explained that not long after that failed attempt, Linda became increasingly involved with the HOA. She volunteered for committees, pushed for rule changes, and made herself indispensable. Eventually, she ran for president and won. At the time, most people thought it was a good thing. She was organized, assertive, and promised to clean things up. What they didn't realize was what she'd been preparing for. As Frank spoke, a pattern began to form that made my chest feel tight. After Linda became president, certain records became harder to find. Old meeting minutes disappeared. Documentation related to past boundary disputes went missing. Anyone who questioned decisions suddenly found themselves buried in violations or singled out for enforcement. People stopped speaking up because it wasn't worth the stress. That's when it hit me. I wasn't being targeted because I'd done something wrong. I was being targeted because I stood in the way. My property just happened to sit where Linda needed it to. Everything she was doing now, the fines, the hate mail, the public accusations, fit into a long game she'd already played once before. Frank looked me straight in the eye and told me something I won't forget. He said Linda doesn't rush. She applies pressure until people get tired, scared, or desperate enough to give in. Most do. They sell, settle, or comply just to make it stop. Hearing that made the situation feel heavier than ever. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. This was strategy. I asked Frank why no one had stopped her sooner. He sighed and said power changes people, especially when no one challenges it. Over time, fear does the rest. That explained the neighbors avoiding eye contact. The silence. The way everyone seemed to know something but refused to say it out loud. Just as I was about to leave, Frank paused and said there was one more thing. Years ago, the HOA had installed security cameras near the common areas, including the back portions of the neighborhood. They were meant to monitor vandalism, but they covered more ground than people realized. He didn't know what happened to the footage, but he knew it existed at one point. I walked back to my car with my mind racing. If those cameras had been running back when Linda made her first attempt, there was a chance they'd captured something she never intended anyone to see. For the first time since this began, I felt something other than pressure and fear. I felt the possibility of proof, and the realization that the truth might still be out there, waiting to be found. Every time the HOA delayed my request, I knew they were hiding something. What Frank told me about those old security cameras wouldn't leave my mind. If footage existed, it meant the truth had been recorded long before I ever moved in. And if the HOA still had control over those records, there was only one reason they wouldn't want me to see them. I started the process the right way. I submitted a formal records request to the HOA, citing my rights as a homeowner. I asked for archived documents related to boundary disputes, past board meetings, and any security footage covering the common areas behind my property. The request was polite, professional, and impossible to misunderstand. I expected resistance, but I didn't expect the silence. Days passed with no response. When I followed up, I received a short email saying the records would take time to locate. A week later, another message arrived claiming some files were no longer available. That phrase stood out to me. Not destroyed, not lost, just unavailable. The kind of vague answer meant to shut people down without giving them anything concrete to challenge. I didn't let it go. I submitted another request, this time referencing state statutes that require HOAs to maintain and provide access to official records. Suddenly, the tone changed. The board responded quickly, but now with excuses. The footage was old. The system had changed. The files might not be readable. Every response felt carefully crafted to discourage me without outright refusing. That's when I escalated. I contacted a local real estate attorney and asked for guidance on how to proceed. With their help, I sent a third request, This one formal and unmistakable. It referenced specific years, camera locations, and retention policies. It made clear that failure to comply could have consequences. For the first time, the HOA didn't reply immediately. When they finally did, the message was different. They claimed no footage existed from that time period, but attached to the email was something they clearly hadn't meant to include. A partial index. Just a list of archived file names. And there it was. A camera log showing dates from years before I bought my home. My hands actually shook as I stared at the screen. They hadn't destroyed the records, they'd buried them. The dates lined up exactly with the time frame Frank had mentioned. Right around the period when Linda first attempted to claim land that wasn't hers. If the cameras were active then, they could show more than paperwork ever could. They could show intent, action, proof. I replied immediately, requesting access to the specific files listed in the log. This time, the delay was longer. Nearly 2 weeks passed. When the response finally came, it was short and cold. They said the footage could be reviewed on-site only, under supervision. No copies, no downloads, just viewing. I agreed without hesitation. At that point, I didn't care how I saw it, only that I did. The appointment was set for a weekday afternoon at the HOA office. I remember driving there with my heart pounding, rehearsing every possible outcome in my head. Part of me expected the footage to be corrupted or incomplete. Another part feared it would confirm everything I suspected. When they finally sat me in front of an old monitor and loaded the files, the room felt unbearably quiet. The screen flickered as the video buffered. No one spoke. I leaned forward, eyes locked on the image, aware that whatever appeared next could change everything. As the timestamp came into focus and the video began to play, I realized I was about to find out whether this fight was worth finishing, or whether I was about to uncover something far worse than I'd imagined. The moment I saw Linda on that screen, pointing at my land, I knew the truth couldn't be buried anymore. At first, the footage looked ordinary, grainy, slightly washed out, the kind of video you expect from an old security system. The camera angle showed the back edge of the neighborhood, an area most people ignored. Then a familiar figure walked into frame, and my breath caught in my chest. It was Linda Whitmore, younger than she is now, but unmistakable. Same posture, same way of moving like she belonged wherever she stood. She wasn't alone. 2 workers followed her, carrying tools I recognized immediately. One of them held a metal stake, another had a mallet. I leaned closer to the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. Linda pointed toward the ground, toward the exact strip of land she now claimed had never been mine. She spoke, animatedly, directing the workers where to place the markers. I watched as one of them drove a stake into the soil, several feet inside what my county survey clearly defined as my property. Then another, and another. Each movement felt like a punch to the gut. The timestamp was right there in the corner of the screen. Years before I bought the house. Years before she ever accused me of encroachment. That detail alone destroyed her entire narrative. This wasn't a mistake made by a previous homeowner. This wasn't confusion over old boundaries. This was deliberate action, taken quietly, long before anyone like me could question it. As the footage continued, Linda walked the line herself, pacing it out, nodding in approval. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. She wasn't asking questions or verifying information. She was asserting control. Every claim she'd made at the HOA meeting unraveled right there in front of me. Her confidence hadn't come from documentation. It had come from the belief that no one would ever see this. I sat back in my chair, my hands clenched so tightly my knuckles hurt. The fear I'd been carrying for months began to shift into something else. Clarity. Anger, yes, but focused anger. The kind that sharpens your thinking instead of clouding it. For the first time, I wasn't guessing anymore. I knew exactly what I was dealing with. Suddenly, the hate mail made sense, the timing, the language, the persistence. It wasn't about enforcing rules. It was about erasing obstacles. I wasn't being punished for violating HOA bylaws. I was being pushed until I broke, until I sold, until I walked away and left the land uncontested. The letters weren't random intimidation. They were part of the same plan I was now watching unfold on that screen. What struck me most was how calm Linda looked in the footage. No urgency, no secrecy, just quiet confidence. She believed this land would eventually be hers, one way or another. And for years she'd gotten away with it because no one had proof. Until now. When the video ended, the room felt smaller. The HOA staff member supervising the viewing avoided my eyes. No one spoke. They didn't need to. We all knew what that footage meant. I asked for confirmation of the file's authenticity, and they gave it reluctantly. Everything was logged. Everything was traceable. As I walked out of that office, my phone buzzed with a new message. Another warning from the HOA. Another reminder that fines were pending. Linda was escalating her pressure, completely unaware that the ground beneath her story had already collapsed. I sat in my car for a long moment, replaying the footage in my mind. I realized something then that changed how I approached everything that followed. I couldn't keep reacting to her moves. Reacting was what she expected. It was time to stop playing defense and start taking action. I realized the only way to protect my home was to take this outside the HOA. Sitting in my car, after watching that footage, I understood something with absolute clarity. The HOA wasn't the place where truth mattered. It was the place Linda controlled, and as long as everything stayed inside that system, she would always have the advantage. The very next morning, I contacted a real estate attorney recommended by a friend who had dealt with boundary disputes before. When I walked into his office, I didn't exaggerate or vent. I laid out the facts, the surveys, the HOA notices, the hate mail, and finally, the video. As he watched the footage, his expression changed in a way that told me I wasn't imagining things. He paused the screen, rewound it, and then leaned back in his chair. He told me what I already suspected but needed to hear from someone who knew the law. What Linda had done wasn't just unethical, it was potentially illegal, directing the movement of boundary markers, using her position for personal gain, and then harassing a homeowner to cover it up crossed multiple lines. More importantly, he said this wasn't something to resolve through HOA meetings or appeals. This needed oversight. With his guidance, we began filing formal complaints. Not emotional letters, not arguments. Official filings backed by evidence. We submitted documentation to the county assessor, the zoning office, and the state agency that oversees HOAs. Every complaint included the same thing: clear timelines, certified surveys, and the video footage that showed intent beyond any reasonable doubt. What surprised me was how quickly the tone changed once the evidence was in the hands of people outside the HOA. Questions came back, requests for clarification, follow-ups, real interest, not dismissal, not vague responses, actual attention. It was the first time since this began that I felt like the system might actually work the way it was supposed to. Throughout all of this, the HOA remained completely unaware of what I'd done. On the surface, everything looked the same. Notices continued. Emails kept coming. Linda kept pushing. In fact, the pressure increased. Fines were reiterated. Deadlines were emphasized. It was as if she sensed control slipping and decided to tighten her grip before it was too late. Then late one afternoon, another HOA email landed in my inbox. This one was marked urgent. An emergency board meeting had been scheduled. The subject line referenced boundary enforcement and compliance actions. I didn't need to read between the lines to know what that meant. Linda was moving fast. Whatever she planned to do, she wanted it done before outside authorities could intervene. I forwarded the notice to my attorney. His response was short and precise. Attend the meeting. Say as little as possible. Let them talk. Let them commit. Those words stuck with me. For months, I'd been defending myself, explaining, reacting. Now the strategy was different. Now I was letting the process expose itself. As the meeting date approached, I felt a strange calm settle in. Not because I expected it to be easy, but because I finally knew where I stood. I wasn't walking in blind anymore. I wasn't relying on hope or fairness. I had proof, and I had people outside the HOA watching closely. Everything that had been building, the hate mail, the fines, the threats, the footage, was converging on that one meeting. Linda believed she still controlled the room. She believed she could pressure me into submission one last time. What she didn't know was that the fight had already moved beyond her reach, and that night, she was about to say things she could never take back. I watched years of intimidation unravel in less than 10 minutes. When I walked into that emergency HOA meeting, the atmosphere felt different from every other one I'd attended. The room was full, more than usual, and people weren't chatting the way they normally did. Conversations were hushed. Faces were tight. Everyone sensed something was about to happen, even if they didn't know what. Linda Whitmore sat at the front as always, posture straight, expression composed, papers neatly arranged in front of her. She looked confident, almost relieved, like someone who believed this meeting would finally put an end to a nuisance. When she called the meeting to order, her voice was firm and authoritative. She wasted no time getting to the point. She repeated the same accusations she'd been making for months. That my fence crossed HOA land, that I'd ignored repeated warnings, that the board had been more than patient with me. She spoke smoothly, confidently, as if repetition alone would turn her claims into truth. A few homeowners nodded along, clearly only hearing her side of the story for the first time. Then she turned toward me and asked if I had anything to say. For the first time since this all began, I didn't rush to defend myself. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I calmly stood up and said there was something everyone deserved to see before any decisions were made. The room shifted immediately. Chairs creaked. People leaned forward. Linda's expression tightened, just slightly, but she gestured for me to continue. I connected my laptop to the projector the HOA used for presentations. The screen flickered, then settled. I told them the footage came from the HOA's own archive security cameras, dated years before I bought my home. Linda opened her mouth to object, but I pressed play before she could speak. The room went silent. There she was on the screen. Linda Whitmore. Younger, but unmistakable. Standing on the same strip of land she claimed had never been mine. Directing workers, pointing, watching as boundary markers were driven into the ground. The timestamp sat clearly in the corner of the video, impossible to ignore. You could feel the shift in the room as people processed what they were seeing. Murmurs spread. Someone whispered, "That's her." Another voice asked, "Why is she doing that?" Linda stood up abruptly and demanded the video be stopped, claiming it was misleading, taken out of context. But it was too late. Context was right there on the screen. Every second that played stripped away another layer of her authority. Board members began asking questions, not of me, but of her. Why hadn't this footage ever been disclosed? Why were outdated maps used instead of county records? Why was she personally present during boundary changes? Linda's calm cracked. Her voice rose. She accused me of manipulating evidence, of targeting her unfairly, of trying to destabilize the community. Then she tried to end the meeting. She declared the footage irrelevant and announced the board would handle the matter internally. But the room wasn't hers anymore. Homeowners spoke up. One board member flatly refused to adjourn. Another said this needed to be documented immediately. The power Linda had wielded for years slipped right through her fingers in real time. I sat back down, my heart pounding, and watched as the narrative completely flipped. Linda wasn't leading anymore. She was defending, and she wasn't doing it well. Her words came faster, sharper, more desperate. Every attempt to regain control only made things worse. That's when someone at the back of the room asked the question that sealed it. If this footage exists, shouldn't the county be looking at it? The room went quiet again, but this time the silence felt final. A board member cleared his throat and said, on the record, that given the evidence presented, an official investigation would be initiated immediately. County authorities would be notified. All boundary enforcement actions would be paused. Linda's head snapped toward him in disbelief. In that moment, I understood something profound. This meeting wasn't the end of the fight. It was the turning point. The intimidation that had defined my life for months had collapsed under the weight of the truth. And as people filed out of the room, whispering and avoiding Linda's gaze, it became clear that whatever happened next would no longer be under her control. The silence after Linda resigned was louder than any threat she ever made. It didn't happen with an announcement or a dramatic confrontation. It happened quietly, almost cautiously, like the neighborhood itself was afraid to breathe too loudly and disturb the moment. An email went out from the HOA stating that Linda Whitmore had stepped down as president, effective immediately. No explanation. No thank you. Just a few dry sentences that marked the end of her control. By then, the county investigation was already underway. Inspectors and officials began requesting documents, surveys, and records directly from the HOA. This time, there were no delays or excuses. The same board members who once sat silently while Linda accused me were suddenly responsive, cooperative, almost eager to distance themselves from her decisions. It was clear they understood the seriousness of what had been uncovered. Within weeks, the first corrections were made. Official land records were reviewed, and the disputed strip of property was flagged for reassessment. Surveyors came out, took measurements, and confirmed what I had known all along. The boundary lines matched my original county survey, not the outdated maps Linda had relied on. Watching those corrections happen felt surreal. For months, I'd been told I was wrong. Now the system itself was saying otherwise. One of the most immediate changes was how suddenly the harassment stopped. The hate mail that had filled my mailbox for months vanished overnight. No more anonymous letters. No more threats disguised as warnings. The HOA notices stopped too. No fines. No follow-ups. No inspections. The pressure that had become part of my daily life lifted so abruptly it took time to realize it was really gone. Neighbors who had avoided me began reaching out. Some stopped by while I was working in the yard. Others caught me during walks and apologized quietly. They admitted they'd heard things, that they were afraid to get involved, that Linda had a way of making people feel like speaking up wasn't worth the consequences. I didn't blame them. Fear spreads easily in places where power goes unchecked. What struck me most was how ordinary everything suddenly felt again. I could sit on my porch without scanning the street. I could open my mailbox without bracing myself. The house felt like mine again. Not a battleground, not a liability, but a home. That shift didn't come from revenge or punishment. It came from accountability. Still, it wasn't over. The investigation continued, and while Linda was gone, the final determination hadn't been made yet. The county needed time to complete its review, issue formal findings, and record the outcome. Everyone knew what the result would be, but until it was official, there was still a sense of suspension. Like waiting for a judge to read a verdict everyone already understands. I kept copies of everything close. The video, the surveys, the emails. Not because I expected another fight, but because I'd learned how quickly things can change when documentation disappears. This time, I wasn't taking chances. As the weeks passed, I checked my mail with a different kind of anticipation. Not fear, but expectation. I was waiting for one last thing. The official confirmation that would close this chapter for good. The piece of paper that would say, beyond any doubt, that the land was mine, and that what happened to me would never happen again. Until that arrived, I waited, knowing the balance of power had already shifted, and that the truth was finally on record. That ruling wasn't just about land. It was about proving I couldn't be bullied out of my own life. The envelope arrived on an ordinary weekday, mixed in with utility bills and junk mail, but I knew the moment I saw the county seal that this was different. My hands were steady when I opened it, but my chest felt tight. I'd waited months for this, and in some ways, years without realizing it. The letter was clear, direct, final. The county confirmed what I had known from the beginning. The disputed land belonged to me. The boundary lines were accurate. The survey was valid. There had never been any legal basis for the HOA's claims. Reading those words felt like exhaling after holding my breath for far too long. Not relief alone, vindication. Alongside that confirmation came consequences. The investigation concluded that Linda Whitmore had used her position improperly, directing actions that benefited her personally while misrepresenting facts to the board and homeowners. Penalties were issued. Civil consequences followed. It wasn't dramatic or public, but it was real. For someone who had thrived on authority and intimidation, losing both mattered more than any apology ever could. The HOA itself changed too. New leadership stepped in, and policies were rewritten to increase transparency and limit unilateral power. Records access was formalized. Boundary issues now required independent verification. It wasn't about punishing the organization. It was about preventing what happened to me from happening again. Watching those reforms take shape gave me a sense of closure I didn't expect. Slowly, the neighborhood settled back into something that felt like normal. Kids played outside again. People waved. Conversations happened without hesitation. The tension that had hovered over the street like a storm cloud finally cleared. It amazed me how quickly peace can return once fear is removed from the equation. I spent a lot of time reflecting during those weeks, about how close I came to giving in just to make it stop, about how easily systems can be twisted when people assume authority equals honesty, and about how important it is for homeowners, especially people my age, to remember that our rights don't disappear just because someone louder claims control. Standing firm wasn't easy. It cost time, energy, and sleep. But it taught me something invaluable. Dignity isn't granted by HOAs, boards, or presidents. It's something you protect, even when it feels uncomfortable to do so. Especially then. I walk my property differently now. Not with suspicion, but with appreciation. Every fence line, every corner of the yard feels earned in a way it didn't before. This house isn't just where I live. It's where I stood my ground. Justice was served. Abuse was exposed. And most importantly, my home and my peace were protected.